Imagine leaving the dock today and not touching land again until this exact date, 1 full year from now. No quick supply runs, no emergency flights home, no solid ground under your feet for the next 365 days, just water, engines, and whatever you built into the hull before you left. That's the deal one billionaire made with himself. And to make it work, he didn't buy a yacht. He commissioned something closer to a floating village, one person, one crew, one hull, built to survive a full year with nothing but what it carried out of the harbor. Now, before we go further, this is a story. A thought experiment built to explore a real question: what does a human being actually need to feel whole? The yacht, the billionaire, the voyage, think of it as a vessel for the idea, not a documentary. But the lessons hiding inside this story are very real, and by the end, I think you'll recognize a few of them from your own life. So let's follow him out past the harbor, past the last lighthouse, and into a year. Why would anyone do this? He wasn't running from anything dramatic. No scandal, no divorce, no disaster. It was quieter than that, the kind of decision that happens after years of the same pattern. Fly somewhere beautiful, stay for 4 days, fly back, repeat. At a certain point, arriving stopped meaning anything because he knew he'd be leaving again before he'd even adjusted to the time zone. So he asked a strange question: what if the vacation never had to end because there was never a back to return to? Here's the first lesson, and it's worth sitting with because most of us live some version of this without noticing. A life spent constantly chasing the next place, the next trip, the next distraction rarely feels full, it just feels busy. Constant motion isn't the same thing as a meaningful life. Sometimes the fastest way to feel lost is to never stay anywhere long enough to feel found. That question, what if the vacation never ended, became the entire engineering brief for the ship. Not make it beautiful, make it livable for 1 full year with no safety net. The problem with a year. Here's something people don't think about: the ocean doesn't care how much money you have. A 5-star hotel can fail for a night and you barely notice. Room service is late, the Wi-Fi drops, someone fixes it by morning. At sea, months from any port, a failure doesn't get fixed by morning. It gets fixed by you, or it doesn't get fixed at all until you're near enough to land to bring in outside help, and by design, that's supposed to be rare. So before a single luxury feature got designed, the team had to answer 4 brutal questions. Where does the food come from for a full year? Where does the power come from with no shore connection? What happens the day something breaks that nobody on board knows how to fix? And what happens to a human mind that doesn't see new land for months at a time? Notice none of those questions are about the size of the swimming pool. They're about whether the whole system survives contact with reality, and that's true of more than just yachts. Any life you build, any routine, any relationship, the real test isn't how good it looks on day one. It's whether it still holds up on the hard, boring, ordinary days when nobody's watching. Building a floating home. So how do you actually design a home that has no walls connecting it to land? You stop thinking like a boat builder and start thinking like someone designing a shelter meant to outlast every convenience it was never given. Everything you need must either be stored in large quantities, produced on board, or maintained continuously. There's no corner store 2 blocks away. The nearest one might be 11 days of open ocean in any direction. The hull itself became the first decision. Instead of a sleek racing profile built for speed, the design shifted toward something wider, heavier, and far more stable, closer to an expedition vessel than a showpiece. Speed matters when you're crossing an ocean for a 2-week charter. Stability matters when the ocean is simply where you live for the next year. Inside, the layout stopped being organized around impressing a guest for a weekend. Instead, it was organized the way a small town is organized: living quarters, yes, but also a working medical bay, a hydroponics section, workshops for repairs, water processing, and storage that dwarfs anything found on a normal charter yacht. And here's the second lesson, quiet but important. The things that actually keep us alive and steady are rarely the things that impress anyone. Nobody admires a water filter or a spare parts locker. But take those away and nothing else on the ship matters. In our own lives, it's the same: the boring habits, the unglamorous routines, the people who quietly show up, those are the load-bearing walls. We just don't notice them until they're gone. Where a year of food comes from. Here's a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Where does someone get food for a full year without ever restocking from a supermarket? The answer isn't just bring a lot of canned food. That works for a couple of months, not 12, and nobody wants to eat only preserved meals for a year straight. So the solution had to be part storage, part production. Deep cold storage handles the bulk staples, protein, grains, the basics that keep well. But alongside that, a working hydroponic growing system produces fresh vegetables and herbs continuously, cycling crops the way a small farm would, just vertical and indoors instead of spread across a field. Fishing supplements the rest not as a hobby but as an actual working part of the food system, with the surrounding ocean functioning as an enormous, unpredictable pantry. And this is where it stops being a luxury feature and starts being a genuine dependency. If the hydroponic systems fail or fishing yields drop for weeks in the wrong stretch of ocean, that's not an inconvenience, it's the first real crack in the entire plan. Which is exactly what almost happened. The first real problem. Everything sounds perfect so far: a stable hull, a working food system, enough power, enough storage, enough planning. But there's one problem nobody accounted for in the original design meetings. What happens when the ocean itself refuses to cooperate for weeks at a time? About 3 months into the voyage, long after the excitement of departure had faded into routine, the yacht crossed into a stretch of water known for unpredictable weather. Not a single dramatic storm, something worse in a way. A stretch of rough seas, low visibility, and constant course adjustments that dragged on for almost 3 weeks straight. It wasn't enough to threaten the ship. The hull was built for far worse. But it was enough to shut down outdoor fishing entirely, delay a scheduled crop rotation in the hydroponics bay, and more subtly start wearing down the crew. Not physically, psychologically. Weeks of gray skies, no clear horizon, and no destination to look forward to because there was no destination, just more ocean. One evening, deep into that third week, one of the younger crew members finally snapped, not over anything serious, just the sheer sameness of it. Same gray water, same walls, same faces. He went up on deck and just shouted into the wind, out of pure frustration, at nothing in particular. And here's the lesson, and it might be the most important one in this whole story. Human beings are not built for endless sameness. We are wired to need novelty, a new face, a new view, a new small thing happening. We are social, adaptive creatures built for change in small doses. That's not weakness. That's design. When your days blur into one repeating shape with no variation and no one new to talk to, something inside you starts to strain, even if every physical need is being met. That's why isolation breaks people faster than hunger does. Comfort isn't the same as well-being. A person can have everything they need and still come undone simply from too much sameness for too long. How the yacht makes its own power. While the crew adjusted to the weather, the systems below deck kept running because, unlike food, power at sea doesn't get a grace period. A ship meant to run for a full year without ever plugging into shore power needs an energy strategy that doesn't rely on any single source failing safely. So the design layered multiple systems together instead of betting everything on one. Efficient hybrid propulsion handles movement without burning through fuel reserves at an unsustainable rate. Solar paneling across the upper deck captures energy during long daylight stretches. An onboard generation acts as the backup layer underneath all of it, keeping the lights, the medical bay, and the food systems running even when the weather turns hostile, the way it just had. None of this makes headlines. Nobody films a generator and calls it exciting. But there's a lesson buried in the boring engineering. Resilience is never one big solution. It's several small, ordinary backups layered quietly on top of each other so that no single failure ever becomes the whole story. That's true of a power grid. It's just as true of a person. The ones who hold up best in hard seasons are rarely the ones with one big strength. They're the ones with several small, steady habits working together underneath the surface. When something breaks and there's no one to call. Here's the scenario every long-range voyage eventually faces. Something breaks and there is no repair shop within 1,000 miles. On a normal superyacht charter, a serious mechanical issue means calling ahead and meeting a service team at the next marina. Out here, the next marina might be over a week away. So the entire maintenance philosophy had to shift from call for help to fix it yourself, on the spot with what's already on board. That meant carrying an inventory of spare parts that would look excessive on any normal vessel, because on this one, excessive is the only acceptable amount. It meant training crew members to be genuinely cross-skilled, so the person managing the kitchen systems could also assist with basic electrical repairs, and the person monitoring navigation had working knowledge of the water systems too. About 5 months in, that philosophy got tested. A mechanical issue in one of the secondary power systems, not catastrophic, but serious enough that on a lesser prepared vessel, it could have forced an early return to land. Instead, the onboard team diagnosed it, pulled from the spare parts inventory, and resolved it over 2 tense days using nothing but what was already on the ship when it left the dock 5 months earlier. The lesson here is simple, and older viewers will likely recognize it from decades of their own lives. Preparation is a form of self-respect. You don't stockpile spare parts because you expect disaster. You do it because you respect the voyage enough to admit that something, eventually, will go wrong. The people and the plans that survive difficulty aren't the ones that avoided problems. They're the ones that were honest enough ahead of time to prepare for them. The midpoint life after 6 months. By month 6, the exact halfway point of the entire voyage, something interesting happens that nobody really talks about when they imagine this kind of life. The extraordinary starts to feel ordinary. The first weeks at sea were filled with a kind of electric novelty. Every sunrise over open water felt significant. Every meal from the hydroponics bay felt like a small triumph. But somewhere around the 5 or 6 month mark, that novelty faded the way it does anywhere, and what was left underneath was just life. Routine, structure. And that turns out to be the real challenge nobody solves with engineering alone. You can build the most self-sufficient vessel on the planet, with enough food, power, and redundancy to survive genuinely anything the ocean throws at it. But you can't engineer away boredom or isolation, or the specific ache of not being able to simply decide to visit somewhere new because you feel like it. So daily structure became its own kind of infrastructure. Scheduled routines, designated workspaces separate from living spaces, so home and work still felt psychologically distinct even without ever leaving the same 300 feet of hull. Regular contact with the outside world through satellite communication, not for logistics, but simply so a year didn't start to feel like a year of complete disappearance. Here's the lesson at the halfway mark, and it's one worth remembering at any age. Structure is not the enemy of freedom, it's what makes freedom bearable long-term. A life with zero schedule sounds like paradise for about a month. After that, most people quietly start building one anyway, because the mind needs a shape to move through, even when it doesn't need to. The problem nobody expected. Here's the twist almost no one saw coming: not a storm, not an engine failure, not a food shortage, something quieter. Around month 9, with the return date now close enough to plan around, the crew began noticing something strange. The closer they got to the scheduled stop for final maintenance and resupply, a brief, planned return near land, the more some of them hesitated about going ashore at all. Not because anything was wrong with the ship, because something had shifted in how they related to land itself. 9 months of consistent structure, minimal outside noise, and a genuinely self-sufficient environment had created something unexpected. A version of daily life that, for some on board, felt calmer and more manageable than the one they'd left behind. Land came with its own chaos. Traffic, crowds, decisions, the sheer sensory overload of a world that never actually promised any of the structure this ship had built into every single day. The lesson here is one of the most human in the entire story. We adapt to whatever environment we consistently live in, for better or worse, and eventually that environment starts to feel like normal, even if it once felt strange or even hard. That's exactly why it's worth asking every so often whether the life you've adapted to is actually good for you, or whether you've just gotten used to it. Comfort and rightness are not the same thing. Sometimes the most honest question a person can ask isn't "Am I comfortable?" It's "Did I choose this, or did I just stop noticing it?" And what the yacht becomes. By month 10, the vessel isn't really the same ship that left the dock, even though nothing about its hull has changed. The hydroponics bay had been reconfigured twice, based on what actually grew well versus what looked good on paper. The crew's daily rhythms had settled into something closer to a small, functioning community than a temporary work rotation. Spaces that started out as the gym or the workshop had slowly absorbed small, personal touches, the kind of accumulated detail that only happens when a space stops being a stopover and starts being genuinely lived in. This is the part that separates this vessel from every luxury superyacht built for 2-week charters. Those ships are designed to look perfect for a photo and then get reset for the next guest. This one was never reset. It just kept accumulating history the way any real home does. Scuffed handrails in high-traffic areas, a slightly different smell in the kitchen from months of use, small fixes made by hand instead of by a design team. The lesson here is one that tends to land hardest with people who have lived long enough to feel it firsthand. A house becomes a home through wear, not through polish. It's the scuff marks, the repairs, the small imperfect fixes made by the people living there, not the showroom finish, that actually make a place feel like yours. Perfection keeps a place looking new. Use is what makes it belong to you. 1 year later. And then, after 12 months, after weeks of rough water that tested everyone's patience, after a mechanical failure fixed with nothing but onboard parts and cross-trained hands, after a food system that had to be relearned more than once, after the strange discovery that isolation could feel more like peace than punishment, the yacht finally turns back toward land, exactly 1 year to the day after it left. Not because the systems failed. They didn't. The hull that left the dock a year earlier was still fully capable of continuing further. It turned back because the original plan simply reached its finish line 1 year, exactly as intended from the very first design meeting. But here's the part that makes this story worth telling instead of just another yacht tour. When land finally came into view, it wasn't the relief anyone expected. For the people who had spent a full year inside that hull, land wasn't simply coming home. It was leaving something behind, too. And that's the real point of everything you just watched. This yacht was never built to prove a billionaire could afford to disappear for a year. It was built, even if only as a story, to ask a much older and much more useful question. What does a person actually need to feel steady, not entertained, not distracted, but genuinely steady? And the answer this story keeps circling back to is almost embarrassingly simple. Not luxury. Not more space, more speed, more comfort. Just 4 things repeated daily: purpose, structure, connection to other people, and small moments of something new. Give a person those 4 things and it turns out they can build a version of home almost anywhere, even in the middle of an ocean, with no land in sight for months at a time. And take those 4 things away, even inside the most comfortable house on solid ground, and no amount of comfort will ever quite replace them.